Hey all, and welcome to the Cosmic Tortoise podcast. This is a reading of the main body of text from Alan Watts's Joyous Cosmology, as well as what I thought was an important caveat at the end within the epilogue. This small book is kind of an amalgamation of Alan Watts's psychedelic experiences. It's an attempt to put that which cannot be put into words, and I couldn't think of a better person to attempt to do that. So strap yourself in and enjoy. The Joyous Cosmology. To begin with, this world has a different kind of time. It is the time of biological rhythm, not of the clock and all that goes with the clock. There is no hurry. Our sense of time is notoriously subjective and thus dependent upon the quality of our attention, whether of interest or boredom, and upon the alignment of our behavior in terms of routines, goals, and deadlines. Here, the present is self-sufficient, but it is not a static present. It is a dancing present, the unfolding of a pattern which has no specific destination in the future, but is simply its own point. It leaves and arrives simultaneously, and the seed is as much the goal as the flower. There is therefore time to perceive every detail of the movement with infinitely greater richness of articulation. Normally, we do not look so much at things as overlook them. The eye sees types and classes, flower, leaf, rock, bird, fire. Mental pictures of things rather than things, rough outlines filled with flat color, always a little dusty and dim. But here the depth of light and structure in a bursting bud go on forever. There is time to see them, time for the whole intricacy of veins and capillaries to develop in consciousness, time to see down and down into the shape of greenness, which is not green at all, but a whole spectrum generalizing itself as green. Purple, gold, the sunlit turquoise of the ocean, the intense luminescence of the emerald. I cannot decide where shape ends and color begins. The bud is opened and the fresh leaves fan out and curve back with a gesture which is unmistakably communicative, but does not say anything except thus. And somehow that is quite satisfactory, even startlingly clear. The meaning is transparent in the same way that the color and the texture are transparent, with light which does not seem to fall upon surfaces from above, but to be right inside the structure and color. Which is of course where it is, for light is an inseparable trinity of sun, object, and eye, and the chemistry of the leaf is its color, its light. Transparency is the property of the eyeball, projected outward as luminous space, interpreting quanta of energy in terms of the gelatinous fibers in the head. I begin to feel that the world is at once inside my head and outside it, and the two, inside and outside, begin to include or cap one another, like an infinite series of concentric spheres. I am unusually aware that everything I am sensing is also my body, that light, color, shape, sound, and texture are terms and properties of the brain conferred upon the outside world. I am not looking at the world, not confronting it. I am knowing it by a continuous process of transforming it into myself, so that everything around me, the whole globe of space, no longer feels away from me, but in the middle. This is at first confusing. I am not quite sure of the direction from which sounds come. The visual space seems to reverberate with them as if it were a drum. The surrounding hills rumble with the sound of a truck, and the rumble and the color shape of the hills become one and the same gesture. I use that word deliberately and shall use it again. The hills are moving into their stillness. They mean something because they are being transformed into my brain, and my brain is an organ of meaning. The forests of redwood trees upon them look like green fire, and the copper gold of the sun-dried grass heaves immensely into the sky. Time is so slow as to be a kind of eternity, and the flavor of eternity transfers itself to the hills. Burnished mountains which I seem to remember from an immeasurably distant past, at once so familiar as to be exotic and yet as familiar as my own hand. Thus transformed into consciousness, into the electric interior luminosity of the nerves, the world seems vaguely insubstantial, developed upon a color film, resounding upon the skin of a drum, pressing, not with weight, but with vibrations interpreted as weight. Solidity is a neurological invention, and, I wonder, can the nerves be solid to themselves? Where do we begin? Does the order of the brain create the order of the world, or the order of the world the brain? The two seem like egg and hen, or like back and front. The physical world is vibration, quanta, but vibrations of what? To the eye, form and color, to the ear, sound, to the nose, scent, to the fingers, touch. But these are all different languages for the same thing, different qualities of sensitivity, different dimensions of consciousness. The question of what are they differing forms seems to have no meaning. What is light to the eye is sound to the ear. I have the image of the senses being terms, forms, or dimensions, not of one thing common to all, but of each other, locked in a circle of mutuality. Closely examined, shape becomes color, which becomes vibration, which becomes sound, which becomes smell, which becomes taste, and then touch, and then again shape. One can see, for example, that the shape of a leaf is its color. There is no outline around the leaf. The outline is the limit where one colored surface becomes another. I see all these sensory dimensions as a round dance, gesticulations of one pattern being transformed into gesticulations of another, and these gesticulations are flowing through a space that has still other dimensions, which I want to describe as tones of emotional color, of light or sound being joyous or fearful, gold elated or lead depressed. These two form a circle of reciprocity, a round spectrum so polarized that we can only describe each in terms of the others. Sometimes the image of the physical world is not so much a dance of gestures as a woven texture. Light, sound, touch, taste, and smell become a continuous warp, with the feeling that the whole dimension of sensation is a single continuum or field. Crossing the warp is a woof representing the dimension of meaning. Moral and aesthetic values, personal or individual uniqueness, logical significance, and expressive form, and the two dimensions interpenetrate so as to make distinguishable shapes seem like ripples in the water of sensation. The warp and the woof stream together, for the weaving is neither flat nor static, but a many-directioned cross-flow of impulses filling the whole volume of space. I feel that the world is on something in somewhat the same way that a color photograph is on a film, underlying and connecting the patches of color, though the film here is a dense rain of energy. I see that what it is on is my brain, that enchanted loom, as Sherrington called it. Brain and world, warp of sense and woof of meaning, seem to interpenetrate inseparably. They hold their boundaries or limits in common in such a way as to define one another and to be impossible without each other. I am listening to the music of an organ. As leaves seemed to gesture, the organ seems quite literally to speak. There is no use of the vox humana stop, but every sound seems to issue from a vast human throat, moist with saliva. As, with the bass pedals, the player moves slowly down the scale, the sounds seem to blow forth in immense, gooey spludges. As I listen more carefully, the spludges acquire texture, expanding circles of vibration finely and evenly toothed like combs, no longer moist and liquidinous like the living throat, but mechanically discontinuous. The sound disintegrates into the innumerable individual drits of vibration. Listening on, the gaps close, or perhaps each individual drit becomes in its turn a spludge. The liquid and the hard, the continuous and the discontinuous, the gooey and the prickly, seem to be transformations of each other, or to be different levels of magnification upon the same thing. This theme recurs in 100 different ways. The inseparable polarity of opposites, or the mutuality and reciprocity of all the possible content of consciousness. It is easy to see theoretically that all perception is of contrasts, figure and ground, light and shadow, clear and vague, firm and weak. But normal attention seems to have difficulty in taking in both at once. Both sensuously and conceptually we seem to move serially from one to the other. We do not seem to be able to attend to the figure without relative unconsciousness of the ground. But in this new world, the mutuality of things is quite clear at every level. The human face, for example, becomes clear in all its aspects, the total form together with each single hair and wrinkle. Faces become all ages at once, for characteristics that suggest age also suggest youth by implication. The bony structure suggesting the skull evokes instantly the newborn infant. The associative couplings of the brain seem to fire simultaneously instead of one at a time, projecting a view of life which may be terrifying in its ambiguity or joyous in its integrity. Decision can be completely paralyzed by the sudden realization that there is no way of having good without evil, or that it is impossible to act upon reliable authority without choosing, from your own inexperience, to do so. If sanity implies madness, and faith doubt, am I basically a psychotic pretending to be sane, a blithering, terrified idiot who manages temporarily to put on an act of being self-possessed? I begin to see my whole life as a masterpiece of duplicity, the confused, helpless, hungry, and hideously sensitive little embryo at the root of me having learned, step by step, to comply, placate, bully, wheedle, natter, bluff, and cheat my way into being taken for a person of competence and reliability. For when it really comes down to it, what do any of us know? I am listening to a priest chanting the Mass and a choir of nuns responding. His mature, cultivated voice rings with the serene authority of the one, holy, Catholic, and Apostolic Church, of the faith once and for all delivered to the saints, and the nuns respond, naively it seems, with childlike, utterly innocent devotion. But listening again, I can hear the priest putting on his voice, hear the inflated, pompous balloon, and the studiedly unctuous tones of a master deceptionist who has the poor little nuns kneeling in their stalls completely cowed. Listen deeper. The nuns are not cowed at all. They are playing possum. With just a little stiffening, the limp gesture of bowing turns into the gesture of the closing claw. With too few men to go around, the nuns know what is good for them, how to bend and survive. But this profoundly cynical view of things is only an intermediate stage. I begin to congratulate the priest on his gamesmanship, on the sheer courage of being able to put up such a performance of authority when he knows precisely nothing. Perhaps there is no other knowing than the mere competence of the act. If, at the heart of one's being, there is no real self to which one ought to be true, sincerity is simply nerve. It lies in the unabashed vigor of the pretense. But pretense is only pretense when it is assumed that the act is not true to the agent. Find the agent. In the priest's voice, I hear down at the root the primordial howl of the beast in the jungle, but it has been inflected, complicated, refined, and textured with centuries of culture. Every new twist, every additional subtlety was a fresh gambit in the game of making the original howl more effective. At first, crude and unconcealed, the cry for food or mate, or just noise for the fun of it, making the rocks echo. Then, rhythm to enchant, then changes of tone to plead or threaten. Then words to specify the need, to promise and bargain. And then, much later, the gambits of indirection. The feminine stratagem of stooping to conquer, the claim to superior worth and renouncing the world for the spirit, the cunning of weakness proving stronger than the might of muscle, and the meek inheriting the earth. As I listen, then, I can hear in that one voice the simultaneous presence of all the levels of man's history, as of all the stages of life before man. Every step in the game becomes as clear as the rings in a severed tree. But this is an ascending hierarchy of maneuvers, of stratagems capping stratagems, all symbolized in the overlays of refinement beneath which the original howl is still sounding. Sometimes the howl shifts from the mating call of the adult animal to the helpless crying of the baby, and I feel all man's music, its pomp and circumstance, its gaiety, its awe, its confident solemnity, as just so much complication and concealment of baby wailing for mother. And as I want to cry with pity, I know I am sorry for myself. I, as an adult, am also back there alone in the dark, just as the primordial howl is still present beneath the sublime modulations of the chant. You poor baby, and yet, you selfish little bastard. As I try to find the agent behind the act, the motivating force at the bottom of the whole thing, I seem to see only an endless ambivalence. Behind the mask of love, I find my innate selfishness. What a predicament I am in if someone asks, "Do you really love me?" I can't say yes without saying no, for the only answer that will really satisfy is, "Yes, I love you so much I could eat you." My love for you is identical with the love for myself. I love you with the purest selfishness. No one wants to be loved out of a sense of duty. So I will be very frank. Yes, I am pure selfish desire, and I love you because you make me feel wonderful, at any rate for the time being. But then I begin to wonder whether there isn't something a bit cunning in this frankness. Is it big of me to be so sincere, to make a play for her by not pretending to be more than I am, unlike the other guys who say they love her for herself? I see there is always something insincere about trying to be sincere, as if I were to say openly, the statement that I am now making is a lie. There seems to be something phony about every attempt to define myself, to be totally honest. The trouble is that I can't see the back, much less the inside of my head. I can't be honest because I don't fully know what I am. Consciousness peers out from a center which it cannot see, and that is the root of the matter. Life seems to resolve itself down to a tiny germ or nipple of sensitivity. I call it the eeny-weeny, a squiggling little nucleus that is trying to make love to itself and can never quite get there. The whole fabulous complexity of vegetable and animal life, as of human civilization, is just a colossal elaboration of the eeny-weeny trying to make the eeny-weeny. I am in love with myself, but cannot seek myself without hiding myself. As I pursue my own tail, it runs away from me. Does the amoeba split itself in two in an attempt to solve this problem? I try to go deeper, sinking thought and feeling down to their ultimate beginnings. What do I mean by loving myself? In what form do I know myself? Always, it seems, in the form of something other, something strange. The landscape I am watching is also a state of myself, of the neurons in my head. I feel the rock in my hand in terms of my own fingers, and nothing is stranger than my own body. The sensation of the pulse, the eye seen through a magnifying glass in the mirror, the shock of realizing that oneself is something in the external world. At root, there is simply no way of separating self from other, self-love from other love. All knowledge of self is knowledge of other, and all knowledge of other, knowledge of self. I begin to see that self and other, the familiar and the strange, the internal and the external, the predictable and the unpredictable imply each other. One is seek, the other is hide, and the more I become aware of their implying each other, the more I feel them to be one with each other. I become curiously affectionate and intimate with all that seemed alien. In the features of everything foreign, threatening, terrifying, incomprehensible, and remote, I begin to recognize myself. Yet this is a myself which I seem to be remembering from long, long ago, not at all my empirical ego of yesterday, not my specious personality. The myself which I am beginning to recognize, which I had forgotten but actually know better than anything else, goes far back beyond my childhood, beyond the time when adults confused me and tried to tell me that I was someone else, when, because they were bigger and stronger, they could terrify me with their imaginary fears and bewilder and outface me in the complicated game that I had not yet learned. The sadism of the teacher explaining the game and yet having to prove his superiority in it. Long before all that, long before I was an embryo in my mother's womb, there looms the ever so familiar stranger, the everything not me, which I recognize, with a joy immeasurably more intense than a meeting of lovers separated by centuries, to be my original self. The good old son of a bitch who got me involved in this whole game. At the same time, everyone and everything around me takes on the feeling of having been there always, and then forgotten, and then remembered again. We are sitting in a garden surrounded in every direction by uncultivated hills, a garden of fuchsias and hummingbirds, and a valley that leads down to the westernmost ocean, and where the gulls take refuge in storms. At some time in the middle of the 20th century, upon an afternoon in the summer, we are drinking around a table on the terrace, eating dark homemade bread and drinking white wine. And yet we seem to have been there forever, for the people with me are no longer the humdrum and harassed little personalities with names, addresses, and social security numbers, the specifically dated mortals we are all pretending to be. They appear rather as immortal archetypes of themselves, without, however, losing their humanity. It is just that their differing characters seem, like the priest's voice, to contain all history. They are at once unique and eternal, men and women, but also gods and goddesses. For now that we have time to look at each other, we become timeless. The human form becomes immeasurably precious, and, as if to symbolize this, the eyes become intelligent jewels, the hair spun gold, and the flesh translucent ivory. Between those who enter this world together, there is also a love which is distinctly Eucharistic, an acceptance of each other's natures from the heights to the depths. Ella, who planted the garden, is a beneficent Circe, sorceress, daughter of the moon, familiar of cats and snakes, herbalist and healer, with the youngest old face one has ever seen, exquisitely wrinkled, silver black hair rippled like flames. Robert is a manifestation of Pan, but a Pan of bulls instead of the Pan of goats, with frizzled short hair tufted into blunt horns. A man all sweating muscle and body, incarnation of exuberant glee. Beryl, his wife, is a nymph who has stepped out of the forest, a mermaid of the land with swinging hair and a dancing body that seems to be naked even when clothed. It is her bread that we are eating, and it tastes like the original bread, of which mother's own bread was a bungled imitation. And then there is Mary, beloved in the usual dusty world, but in this world an embodiment of light and gold, daughter of the sun, with eyes formed from the evening sky, a creature of all ages, baby, moppet, maid, matron, crone, and corpse, evoking love of all ages. I try to find words that will suggest the numinous, mythological quality of these people. Yet, at the same time, they are as familiar as if I had known them for centuries, or rather, as if I were recognizing them again as lost friends whom I knew at the beginning of time from a country begotten before all worlds. This is of course bound up with the recognition of my own most ancient identity, older by far than the blind squiggling of the eeny-weeny, as if the highest form that consciousness could take had somehow been present at the very beginning of things. All of us look at each other knowingly, for the feeling that we knew each other in that most distant past conceals something else, tacit, awesome, almost unmentionable. The realization that at the deep center of a time perpendicular to ordinary time we are, and always have been, one. We acknowledge the marvelously hidden plot, the master illusion, whereby we appear to be different. The shock of recognition. In the form of everything most other, alien and remote, the ever-receding galaxies, the mystery of death, the terrors of disease and madness, the foreign-feeling, goose-flesh world of sea monsters and spiders, the queasy labyrinth of my own insides. In all these forms I have crept up on myself and yelled, "Boo!" I scare myself out of my wits, and while out of my wits, cannot remember just how it happened. Ordinarily, I am lost in a maze. I don't know how I got here, for I have lost the thread and forgotten the intricately convoluted system of passages through which the game of hide-and-seek was pursued. Was it the path I followed in growing the circuits of my brain? But now the principle of the maze is clear. It is the device of something turning back upon itself, so as to seem to be other, and the turns have been so many and so dizzyingly complex that I am quite bewildered. The principle is that all dualities and opposites are not disjoined but polar. They do not encounter and confront one another from afar. They exfoliate from a common center. Ordinary thinking conceals polarity and relativity because it employs terms, the terminals or ends, the poles, neglecting what lies between them. The difference of front and back, to be and not to be, hides their unity and mutuality. Now consciousness, sense perception, is always a sensation of contrasts. It is a specialization in differences, in noticing, and nothing is definable, classifiable, or noticeable except by contrast with something else. But man does not live by consciousness alone, for the linear, step-by-step, contrast-by-contrast procedure of attention is quite inadequate for organizing anything so complex as a living body. The body itself has an omniscience, which is unconscious or superconscious, just because it deals with relation instead of contrast, with harmonies rather than discords. It thinks or organizes as a plant grows, not as a botanist describes its growth. This is why Shiva has 10 arms, for he represents the dance of life, the omnipotence of being able to do innumerably many things at once. In the type of experience I am describing, it seems that the superconscious method of thinking becomes conscious. We see the world as the whole body sees it, and for this very reason, there is the greatest difficulty in attempting to translate this mode of vision into a form of language that is based on contrast and classification. To the extent, then, that man has become a being centered in consciousness, he has become centered in clash, conflict, and discord. He ignores, as beneath notice, the astounding perfection of his organism as a whole, and this is why, in most people, there is such a deplorable disparity between the intelligent and marvelous order of their bodies and the trivial preoccupations by their consciousness. But in this other world, the situation is reversed. Ordinary people look like gods, because the values of the organism are uppermost, and the concerns of consciousness fall back into the subordinate position which they should properly hold. Love, unity, harmony, and relationship therefore take precedence over war and division. For what consciousness overlooks is the fact that all boundaries and divisions are held in common by their opposite sides and areas, so that when a boundary changes its shape, both sides move together. It is like the yin-yang symbol of the Chinese, the black and white fishes divided by an S-curve inscribed within a circle. The bulging head of one is the narrowing tail of the other. But how much more difficult is it to see that my skin and its movements belong both to me and to the external world, or that the spheres of influence of different human beings have common walls like so many rooms in a house, so that the movement of my wall is also the movement of yours. You can do what you like in your room, just so long as I can do what I like in mine. But each man's room is himself in its fullest extension, so that my expansion is your contradiction, and vice versa. I am looking at what I would ordinarily call a confusion of bushes, a tangle of plants and weeds with branches and leaves going every which way. But now that the organizing relational mind is uppermost, I see that what is confusing is not the bushes, but my clumsy method of thinking. Every twig is in its proper place, and the tangle has become an arabesque more delicately ordered than the fabulous doodles in the margins of Celtic manuscripts. In this same state of consciousness, I have seen a woodland at fall, with the whole multitude of bare branches and twigs in silhouette against the sky, not as a confusion, but as the lacework or tracery of an enchanted jeweller. A rotten log bearing rows of fungus and patches of moss became as precious as any work of Cellini, an inwardly luminous construct of jet, amber, jade, and ivory, all the porous and spongy disintegrations of the wood seeming to have been carved out with infinite patience and skill. I do not know whether this mode of vision organizes the world in the same way that it organizes the body, or whether it is just that the natural world is organized in that way. A journey into this new mode of consciousness gives one a marvelously enhanced appreciation of patterning in nature, a fascination deeper than ever with the structure of ferns, the formation of crystals, the markings upon seashells, the incredible jewellery of such unicellular creatures of the ocean as the radiolaria, the fairy architecture of seeds and pods, the engineering of bones and skeletons, the aerodynamics of feathers, and the astonishing profusion of eye-forms upon the wings of butterflies and birds. All of this involved delicacy of organization may, from one point of view, be strictly functional for the purposes of reproduction and survival. But when you come down to it, the survival of these creatures is the same as their very existence. And what is that for? More and more it seems that the ordering of nature is an art akin to music. Fugues in shell and cartilage, counterpoint and fibers and capillaries, throbbing rhythm and waves of sound, light and nerve. And oneself is connected with it quite inextricably. A node, a ganglion, an electronic interweaving of paths, circuits, and impulses that stretch and hum through the whole of time and space. The entire pattern swirls in its complexity like smoke in sunbeams or the rippling networks of sunlight in shallow water. Transforming itself endlessly into itself, the pattern alone remains. The crosspoints, nodes, nets, and curlicues vanish perpetually into each other. The baseless fabric of this vision. It is its own base. When the ground dissolves beneath me, I float. Closed-eyed fantasies in this world seem sometimes to be revelations of the secret workings of the brain, of the associative and patterning processes, the ordering systems which carry out all our sensing and thinking. Unlike the one I have just described, they are for the most part ever more complex variations upon a theme. Ferns sprouting ferns in multidimensional spaces. Vast kaleidoscopic domes of stained glass or mosaic, or patterns like the models of highly intricate molecules. Systems of colored balls, each one of which turns out to be a multitude of smaller balls, forever and ever. Is this, perhaps, an inner view of the organizing process, which, when the eyes are open, makes sense of the world, even at points where it appears to be supremely messy? Later that same afternoon, Robert takes us over to his barn, from which he has been cleaning out junk and piling it into a big and battered Buick convertible, with all the stuffing coming out of the upholstery. The sight of trash poses two of the great questions of human life. Where are we going to put it? And who's going to clean it up? From one point of view, living creatures are simply tubes, putting things in at one end and pushing them out at the other, until the tube wears out. The problem is always where to put what is pushed out at the other end, especially when it begins to pile so high that the tubes are in danger of being crowded off the earth by their own refuse. And the questions have metaphysical overtones. Where are we going to put it? Asks for the foundation upon which things ultimately rest, the first cause, the divine ground, the basis of morality, the origin of action. Who's going to clean it up is asking where responsibility ultimately lies, or how to solve our ever-multiplying problems other than by passing the buck to the next generation. I contemplate the mystery of trash in its immediate manifestation. Robert's car piled high, with only the driver's seat left unoccupied by broken door frames, rusty stoves, tangles of chicken wire, squashed cans, insides of ancient harmoniums, nameless enormities of cracked plastic, headless dolls, bicycles without wheels, torn cushions vomiting kapok, non-returnable bottles, busted dressmakers' dummies, rhomboid picture frames, scattered bird cages, and inconceivable messes of string, electric wiring, orange peels, eggshells, potato skins, and light bulbs, all garnished with some ghastly white chemical powder that we call angel shit. Tomorrow we shall escort this in a joyous convoy to the local dump. And then what? Can any melting and burning imaginable get rid of these ever-rising mountains of ruin, especially when the things we make and build are beginning to look more and more like rubbish even before they are thrown away? The only answer seems to be that of the present group. The sight of Robert's car has everyone helpless with hysterics. The divine comedy. All things dissolve in laughter. And for Robert, this huge heap of marvelously incongruous uselessness is a veritable creation, a masterpiece of nonsense. He slams it together and ropes it securely to the bulbous, low-slung wreck of the supposedly cheap convertible, and then stands back to admire it as if it were the float of a carnival. Theme: the American way of life. But our laughter is without malice, for in this state of consciousness everything is the doing of the gods. The culmination of civilization in monumental heaps of junk is seen not as thoughtless ugliness, but as self-caricature, as the creation of phenomenally absurd collages and abstract sculptures, in deliberate but kindly mockery of its own pretensions. For in this world nothing is wrong, nothing is even stupid. The sense of wrong is simply failure to see where something fits into a pattern, to be confused as to the hierarchical level upon which an event belongs. A play which seems quite improper at level 28 may be exactly right at level 96. I'm speaking of levels or stages in the labyrinth of twists and turns, gambits and counter-gambits, in which life is involving and evolving itself. The cosmological one-upmanship which the yang and the yin, the light and the dark principles, are forever playing. The game which at some early level in its development seems to be the serious battle between good and evil. If the square may be defined as one who takes the game seriously, one must admire him for the very depth of his involvement, for the courage to be so far out, that he doesn't know where he started. The more prosaic, the more dreadfully ordinary anyone or anything seems to be, the more I am moved to marvel at the ingenuity with which divinity hides in order to seek itself, at the length to which this cosmic joie de vivre will go on elaborating its dance. I think of a corner gas station on a hot afternoon. Dust and exhaust fumes, the regular standard guy all baseball and sports cars, the billboards half-heartedly gaudy, the flatness so reassuring. Nothing around here, but just us folks. I can see people pretending not to see that they are avatars of Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva, and that the cells of their bodies aren't millions of gods, that the dust isn't a haze of jewels. How solemnly they would go through the act of not understanding me if I were to step up and say, "Well, who do you think you're kidding? Come off it, Shiva, you old rascal. It's a great act, but it doesn't fool me." But the conscious ego doesn't know that it is something which the divine organ, the body, is only pretending to be. When people go to a guru, a master of wisdom, seeking a way out of darkness, all he really does is to humor them in their pretense until they are outfaced into dropping it. He tells nothing, but the twinkle in his eye speaks to the unconscious. You know. In the contrast world of ordinary consciousness, man feels himself, as will, to be something in nature but not of it. He likes or dislikes it. He accepts or resists it. He moves it or it moves him. But in the basic superconsciousness of the whole organism, this division does not exist. The organism and its surrounding world are a single integrated pattern of action in which there is neither subject nor object, doer nor done to. At this level there is not one thing called pain, and another thing called myself, which dislikes pain. Pain and the response to pain are the same thing. When this becomes conscious, it feels as if everything that happens is my own will. But this is a preliminary and clumsy way of feeling that what happens outside the body is one process with what happens inside it. This is that original identity which ordinary language and our conventional definitions of man so completely conceal. The active and the passive are two phases of the same act. A seed, floating in its white sunburst of down, drifts across the sky, sighing with the sound of a jet plane invisible above. I catch it by one hair between thumb and index finger, and am astonished to watch this little creature actually wiggling and pulling as if it were struggling to get away. Common sense tells me that this tugging is the action of the wind, not of the thistledown. But then I recognize that it is the intelligence of the seed, to have just such delicate antennae of silk that in an environment of wind it can move. Having such extensions, it moves itself with the wind. When it comes to it, is there any basic difference between putting up a sail and pulling an oar? If anything, the former is a more intelligent use of effort than the latter. True, the seed does not intend to move itself with the wind, but neither did I intend to have arms and legs. It is this vivid realization of the reciprocity of will and world, active and passive, inside and outside, self and not self, which evokes the aspect of these experiences that is most puzzling from the standpoint of ordinary consciousness, the strange and seemingly unholy conviction that I am God. In Western culture, this sensation is seen as the very signature of insanity. But in India, it is simply a matter of course that the deepest center of man, Atman, is the deepest center of the universe, Brahman. Why not? Surely a continuous view of the world is more whole, more holy, more healthy than one in which there is a yawning emptiness between the cause and its effects. Obviously, the I which is God is not the ego, the consciousness of self, which is simultaneously an unconsciousness of the fact that its outer limits are held in common with the inner limits of the rest of the world. But in this wider, less ignorant consciousness, I am forced to see that everything I claim to will and intend has a common boundary with all I pretend to disown. The limits of what I will, the form and shape of all those actions which I claim as mine, are identical and coterminous with the limits of those events which I have been taught to define as alien and external. The feeling of self is no longer confined to the inside of the skin. Instead, my individual being seems to grow out from the rest of the universe like a hair from a head or a limb from a body, so that my center is also the center of the whole. I find that in ordinary consciousness, I am habitually trying to wring myself off from this totality, that I am perpetually on the defensive. But what am I trying to protect? Only very occasionally are my defensive attitudes directly concerned with warding off physical damage or deprivation. For the most part, I am defending my defenses, rings around rings around rings around nothing. Guards inside a fortress, inside entrenchments, inside a radar curtain. The military war is the outward parody of the war of the ego versus world. Only the guards are safe. In the next war, only the Air Force will outlive the women and children. I trace myself back through the labyrinth of my brain, through the innumerable turns by which I have wringed myself off, and by perpetual circling, obliterated the original trail whereby I entered this forest. Back through the tunnels, through the devious status and survival strategies of adult life, through the interminable passages which we remember in dreams, all the streets we have ever traveled, the corridors of schools, the winding pathways between the legs of tables and chairs where we once crawled as a child, the tight and bloody exit from the womb, the fountainous surge through the channel of the penis, the timeless wanderings through ducts and spongy caverns, down and back through ever-narrowing tubes to the point where the passage itself is the traveller, a thin string of molecules going through the trial and error of getting itself into the right order to be a unit of organic life. Relentlessly back and back through endless and whirling dances in the astronomically proportioned spaces which surround the original nuclei of the world, the center of centers, as remotely distant on the inside as the nebulae beyond our galaxy on the outside. Down and at last out of the cosmic maze to recognize in and as myself, the bewildered traveller, the forgotten yet familiar sensation of the original impulse of all things, supreme identity, inmost light, ultimate center, self more me than myself. Standing in the midst of Allah's garden, I feel, with a peace so deep that it sings to be shared with all the world, that at last I belong, that I have returned to the home behind home, that I have come into the inheritance unknowingly bequeathed from all my ancestors since the beginning. Plucked like the strings of a harp, the warp and the woof of the world reverberate with memories of triumphant hymns. The sure foundation upon which I had sought to stand has turned out to be the center from which I seek. The elusive substance beneath all the forms of the universe is discovered as the immediate gesture of my hand. But how did I ever get lost? And why have I travelled so far through these intertwined tunnels that I seem to be the quaking vortex of defended defensiveness which is my conventional self? Going indoors, I find that all the household furniture is alive. Everything gestures. Tables are tabling, pots are potting, walls are walling, fixtures are fixturing, a world of events instead of things. Robert turns on the phonograph without telling me what is being played. Looking intently at the pictures picturing, I only gradually become conscious of the music, and at first cannot decide whether I am hearing an instrument or a human voice simply tailing. A single stream of sound, curving, rippling, and jiggling with a soft snarl that at last reveals to be a reed instrument, some sort of oboe. Later, human voices join it. but they are not all singing words, nothing but a kind of bo, bo, be, which seems to be exploring all the liquidinous inflections of which the voice is capable. What has Robert got here? I imagine it must be some of his far-out friends in a great session of nonsense chanting. The singing intensifies into the most refined, exuberant, and delightful warbling, burbling, honking, hooting, and howling, which quite obviously means nothing whatsoever, and is being done out of pure glee. There is a pause. A voice says, "Dit." Another seems to reply, "Da." Then, "Dit dal di ditty da," and getting gradually faster. "Da di ditty dee dee da da. Ditty 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 da dee ditty ditty da da." And so on, until the players are quite out of their minds. The record cover, which Robert now shows me, says Classical Music of India, and informs me that this is a series edited by Alan Danilou, who happens to be the most serious, esoteric, and learned scholar of Hindi music, and an exponent in the line of Rene Guénon and Ananda Kumaraswamy of the most formal, traditional, and difficult interpretation of yoga and Vedanta. Somehow I cannot quite reconcile Danilou, the pandit of pandits, with this delirious outpouring of human birdsong. I feel my leg is being pulled, or perhaps Danilou's leg. But then, maybe not. Oh, indeed not. For quite suddenly I feel my understanding dawning into a colossal clarity, as if everything were opening up down to the roots of my being and of time and space themselves. The sense of the world becomes totally obvious. I am struck with amazement that I, or anyone, could have thought life a problem or being a mystery. I call everyone to gather round. Listen, there's something I must tell. I've never seen it so clearly. But it doesn't matter a bit if you don't understand, because each one of you is quite perfect as you are, even if you don't know it. Life is basically a gesture, but no one, no thing is making it. There is no necessity for it to happen, and none for it to go on happening. For it isn't being driven by anything. It just happens freely of itself. It's a gesture of motion, of sound, of color, and just as no one is making it, it isn't happening to anyone. There is simply no problem of life. It is completely purposeless play, exuberance which is its own end. Basically, there is the gesture. Time, space, and multiplicity are complications of it. There is no reason whatever to explain it, for explanations are just another form of complexity, a new manifestation of life on top of life, of gestures gesturing. Pain and suffering are simply extreme forms of play, and there isn't anything in the whole universe to be afraid of because it doesn't happen to anyone. There isn't any substantial ego at all. The ego is a kind of flip, a knowing of knowing, a fearing of fearing. It's a curlicue, an extra jazz to experience, a sort of double take or reverberation, a dithering of consciousness which is the same as anxiety. Of course, to say that life is just a gesture, an action without agent, recipient, or purpose, sounds much more empty and futile than joyous. But to me it seems that an ego, a substantial entity to which experience happens, is more of a minus than a plus. It is an estrangement from experience, a lack of participation. And in this moment I feel absolutely with the world, free of that chronic resistance to experience which blocks the free flowing of life and makes us move like muscle-bound dancers. But I don't have to overcome resistance. I see that resistance, ego, is just an extra vortex in the stream, part of it, and that in fact there is no actual resistance at all. There is no point from which to confront life or stand against it. I go into the garden again. The hummingbirds are soaring up and falling in their mating dance, as if there was someone behind the bushes playing ball with them. Fruit and more wine have been put out on the table. Oranges, transformations of the sun into its own image, as if the tree were acknowledging gratitude for warmth. Leaves, green with the pale, yellow fresh green that I remember from the springtimes of my childhood in Kentish spinneys, where breaking buds were spotted all over the hazel branches in a floating mist. Within them, trunks, boughs and twigs, moist black behind the sunlit screen. Fuchsia bushes, strangled traceries of stalks, intermingled with thousands of magenta ballerinas with purple petticoats. And, behind all, towering into the near twilight sky, the grove of giant eucalyptus trees with their waving clusters of distinctly individual, bamboo-like leaves. Everything here is the visual form of the lilting nonsense and abandoned vocal dexterity of those Hindu musicians. I recall the words of an ancient tantric scripture. As waves come with water and flames with fire, so the universal waves with us. Gestures of the gesture, waves of the wave, leaves flowing into caterpillars, grass into cows, milk into babies, bodies into worms, earth into flowers, seeds into birds, quanta of energy into the iridescent or reverberating labyrinths of the brain. Within and swept into this endless, exalting cosmological dance are the bass and grinding undertones of the pain which transformation involves. Chewed nerve endings, sudden electric striking snakes in the meadow grass, swoop of the lazily circling hawks, sore muscles piling logs, sleepless nights trying to keep track of the unrelenting bookkeeping which civilized survival demands. How unfamiliarly natural it is to see pain as no longer a problem. For problematic pain arises with the tendency of self-consciousness to short-circuit the brain and fill its passages with dithering echoes, revulsions to revulsions, fears of fear, cringing from cringing, guilt about guilt, twisting thought to trap itself in endless oscillations. In his ordinary consciousness, man lives like someone trying to speak in an excessively sensitive echo chamber. He can proceed only by doggedly ignoring the interminably gibbering reflections of his voice. For in the brain there are echoes and reflected images in every dimension of sense, thought, and feeling, chattering on in the tunnels of memory. The difficulty is that we confuse the storing of information with an intelligent commentary on what we are doing at the moment, mistaking for intelligence the raw materials of the data with which it works. Like too much alcohol, self-consciousness makes us see ourselves double, and we mistake the double image for two selves, mental and material, controlling and controlled, reflective and spontaneous. Thus, instead of suffering, we suffer about suffering, and suffer about suffering about suffering. As has always been said, clarity comes with the giving up of self. But what this means is that we cease to attribute selfhood to these echoes and mirror images. Otherwise we stand in a hall of mirrors, dancing hesitantly and irresolutely because we are making the images take the lead. We move in circles because we are following what we have already done. We have lost touch with our original identity, which is not the system of images, but the great self-moving gesture of this as yet unremembered moment. The gift of remembering and binding time creates the illusion that the past stands to the present as agent to act, mover to moved. Living thus from the past, with echoes taking the lead, we are not truly here, and are always a little late for the feast. Yet could anything be more obvious than that the past follows from the present like a comet's tail, and that if we are to be alive at all, here is the place to be? Evening at last closes a day that seemed to have been going on since the world began. At the high end of the garden, above a clearing, there stands against the mountain wall a semicircle of trees, immensely tall and dense with foliage, suggesting the entrance grove to some ancient temple. It is from here that the deep blue-green transparency of twilight comes down, silencing the birds and hushing our own conversation. We have been watching the sunset, sitting in a row upon the ridgepole of the great barn, whose roof of redwood tiles, warped and cracked, sweeps clear to the ground. Below, to the west, lies an open sward where 2 white goats are munching the grass, and beyond this is Robert's house, where the lights in the kitchen show that Beryl is preparing dinner. Time to go in and leave the garden to the awakening stars. Again, music, harpsichords and a string orchestra, and Bach in his most exultant mood. I lie down to listen and close my eyes. All day, and wave after wave, and from all directions of the mind's compass, there has repeatedly come upon me the sense of my original identity as one with the very fountain of the universe. I have seen, too, that the mountain is its own source and motive, and that its spirit is an unbounded playfulness, which is the many-dimensioned dance of life. There is no problem left, but who will believe it? Will I believe it myself when I return to normal consciousness? Yet I can see at the moment that this does not matter. The play is hide and seek, or lost and found, and it is all part of the play that one can get very lost indeed. How far, then, can one go in getting found? As if in answer to my question, there appears before my closed eyes a vision in symbolic form of what Eliot has called the still point of the turning world. I find myself looking down at the floor of a vast courtyard, as if from a window high upon the wall, and the floor and the walls are entirely surfaced, with ceramic tiles displaying densely involved arabesques in gold, purple, and blue. The scene might be the inner court of some Persian palace, were it not of such immense proportions, and its colours of such preternatural transparency. In the centre of the floor there is a great sunken arena, shaped like a combination of star and rose, and bordered with a strip of tiles that suggest the finest inlay work in vermilion, gold, and obsidian. Within this arena, some kind of ritual is being performed in time with the music. At first, its mood is stately and royal, as if there were officers and courtiers in rich armour and many-coloured cloaks dancing before their king. As I watch, the mood changes. The courtiers become angels with wings of golden fire, and in the centre of the arena there appears to be a pool of dazzling flame. Looking into the pool I see, just for a moment, a face which reminds me of the Christos Pantocrator of the Byzantine mosaics, and I feel that the angels are drawing back with wings over their faces in a motion of reverent dread. But the face dissolves. The pool of flame grows brighter and brighter, and I notice that the winged beings are drawing back with a gesture, not of dread, but of tenderness, for the flame knows no anger. Its warmth and radiance, tongues of flame enfolded, are an efflorescence of love so endearing that I feel I have seen the heart of all hearts. Epilogue. This is, as I've said, a record not of one experiment with consciousness-changing drugs, but of several, compressed for reasons of poetic unity into a single day. At the same time, I have more or less kept to the basic form which every individual experiment seems to take, a sort of cycle in which one's personality is taken apart and then put together again in what one hopes is a more intelligent fashion. For example, one's true identity is first of all felt as something extremely ancient, familiarly distant, with overtones of the magical, mythological, and archaic. But in the end, it revolves back to what one is in the immediate present, for the moment of the world's creation is seen to lie, not in some unthinkably remote past, but in the eternal now. Similarly, the play of life is at first apprehended rather cynically as an extremely intricate contest in one-upmanship, expressing itself deviously, even in the most altruistic of human endeavors. Later, one begins to feel a good old rascal attitude towards the system. Humor gets the better of cynicism. But finally, rapacious and all-embracing cosmic selfishness turns out to be a disguise for the unmotivated play of love. But I do not mean to generalize. I am speaking only of what I've experienced for myself, and I wish to repeat that drugs of this kind are in no sense bottled and pre-digested wisdom. I feel, had I no skill as a writer or philosopher, drugs which dissolve some of the barriers between ordinary, pedestrian consciousness and the multidimensional superconsciousness of the organism would bring little but delightful or sometimes terrifying confusion. I'm not saying that only intellectuals can benefit from them, but that there must be sufficient discipline or insight to relate this expanded consciousness to our normal, everyday life. The view of man disclosed by these remarkable medicines, which temporarily dissolve our defenses and permit us to see what separative consciousness normally ignores, the world as an interrelated whole, is assuredly far beyond any drug-induced hallucination or superstitious fantasy. It bears a striking resemblance to the unfamiliar universe that physicists and biologists are trying to describe here and now, for the clear direction of their thought is towards the revelation of a unified cosmology, no longer sundered by the ancient irreconcilables of mind and matter, substance and attribute, thing and event, agent and act, stuff and energy. And if this should come to be a universe in which man is neither thought nor felt to be a lonely subject confronted by alien and threatening objects, we shall have a cosmology not only unified but also joyous.